Hey everybody, thanks for checking in once again. Now we're all used to using cameras like this, my Fujifilm X-T3 and various other digital cameras, and many of them out there, and many of us use them. These cameras can shoot in pretty much any conditions, but it wasn't always like that, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what photography was like in the 70s and 80s. Now, the first thing to note, which I'm sure you already know, is that there was only film. That was the only recording medium that was available at the time, and film, of course, was a 19th century technology. It was one of those incredible technologies. There was a whole raft of them that defined the century to come, right at the end of the 19th century, and photography was one of them. So film photography is a very old tech, and it's a passive tech as well. You know, today's sensors, they're active imaging systems, and you can make adjustments on the fly to the image before it's recorded, and in some cases as it's being recorded as well, in the case of video. Back in the film days, you couldn't do that. The technology was entirely passive, and of course that technology dictates the nature of the medium. It sets its parameters and constraints, and it pretty much defines what it can and what it can't do. So everybody shot film. 35mm was, I guess, probably the most popular, the most commonly used kind of film, but 110 film, of course, was very big in those days. I guess anybody who really just wanted a snapshot camera just to record images of family and friends and, you know, various important dates might well get a 110 snapshot camera. The images weren't great, but they were images, and the cameras were really nice, really small and cute and pocketable, and they were lovely little things to look at. So most people shot 35mm or 110. Occasionally people shot 120, but just like today, those who shot medium format tended to be professionals rather than amateurs. I guess a few hobbyists would do it, some advanced hobbyists, but not very many used 120. And the speed of the film that most people used was pretty limited as well. I remember in the late 70s, all I could really find for consumer film was either 100 ISO, which I shot a lot of, or 400 ISO, which I considered, you know, a really exotic technology at the time, because it would give you a couple of extra stops of light at the expense of grain. I never found it too grainy personally. I always found 400 entirely acceptable, as I do today. But that meant there was a big limit on what you could film, because your maximum sensitivity really was 400 ISO. There were some 800 ISO films available, and I believe there was some that went right the way up to 3200, but they were very exotic, very rare. You certainly wouldn't find them on the shelves of your local Dixon's or wherever you would buy your film from. Film isn't that sharp either, you know. Digital has far outstripped film now in terms of sharpness. The digital sensors are now up to 40-50 megapixels and more. That's very common, and so there have had to be lenses created that can actually resolve that have that resolving power. Certainly film wasn't that sharp. I mean, you can get good sharpness out of film, but I've always found that digital is naturally that bit sharper and gives you a noticeable increase in sharpness. So those two things, film speed and the fact that most of the images weren't terribly sharp, those are two big limiting factors on that technology. So, you know, in the winter time here in the UK, it gets dark early. You want to take a shot after half three in the afternoon. You've got 100 ISO film loaded. You're probably going to be disappointed unless you've got a tripod and lots of patience. So most shots that amateurs shot, everyday photographers shot, were usually shot in pretty good sunlight. But of course, film's only half the story. What about cameras? Well, I've got a typical camera of the era here. I'm sure you've seen this before if you've seen this channel before, or if you've watched more than a few videos. Canon T70, this is a typical SLR of the time. It doesn't have the classic SLR looks, this one. There's a slightly later one of the mid-80s, but most consumer photographers, or rather most hobby photographers, most amateur photographers, or many of them would have, any of them who considered themselves proper photographers would have an SLR like this one. But that wasn't the whole story, there were lots of other cameras available too. There were many snapshot cameras available for the 35mm film format, and there still are actually those cameras that have just been released by Kodak, the little plastic ones. Lots of fun, I'm sure, to snap away with, but they're not going to make you any particularly nice images, or certainly not technically nice images. And a lot of people had those kinds of snapshot cameras in the 70s and 80s. They were quite common. There were also cameras with some adjustment, because of course snapshot cameras don't have any adjustment. They only work in good light, usually only one aperture and fixed focus. And then there were cameras with some adjustments. Maybe there were one or two shutter speeds, maybe there were 2 or 3 aperture settings. And then of course, after those, the next level after those, then we get the SLRs like this one, and the rangefinders like the Zorkis and Feds and the Leicas of the time also. Those tended to be used by photographers who considered themselves serious and who, considered that they knew what they were talking about. Those were the kinds of cameras that photographers who wanted to make a really nice image, who wanted to control the image, went for. And of course, the other big category of cameras that were popular at the time was Polaroids. There were loads and loads of Polaroid cameras available as well, and I had one. It was my first camera that I got when I was 14 or 13 maybe, for Christmas, quite some time ago now. And that was a snapshot camera also. The SX70 was a more adjustable camera, but even that was, it had a nice lens and it had a focusing thing, and it was an SLR, but it didn't have many exposure options, and it didn't have interchangeable lenses. But nevertheless, Polaroids were very popular at that time because they were instant and you didn't have to wait for developing, and that was a really big thing at the time. So Polaroids were really high tech at the time, but if you wanted to use a Polaroid, I guess like now, you had to be aware that the film cost was probably 2 or 3 times, even including developing the film cost, was 2 or 3 times what the standard prints cost, 35 or 110 costs. So you probably needed to have slightly deeper pockets than usual to get very much use out of a Polaroid. All right, let's talk about the lenses of that time. And I guess on this channel, we don't need to talk too much about those lenses, because that's essentially what this channel is about. This channel is about shooting and using those lovely old optics in conjunction with modern digital cameras. So the lenses are still very much in vogue. After having a period in the wilderness of a few years, they're now very much back in vogue. They tend to have more entertaining blur than modern lenses do. Modern lenses are very sharp, technical masterpieces. They give you uniform blur at almost any distance, almost any relation of distances between your subject, your camera and your background. But that blur tends to be, isn't always, but tends to be rather bland. 70s and 80s lenses were calculated in here, and so errors arose. You couldn't get the calculations as perfect as the computers get them today, and also the grinding technology was different. You couldn't quite grind to those fine tolerances that you can today, so there were errors in those old optics, and that's what accounts for their very, very entertaining and characterful blur that we that is so much sought after today. Autofocus, well, that I don't know of a single autofocus camera from the 1970s. As far as I'm aware, I might be wrong. If you know different, do tell me in the comments. But as far as I'm aware, autofocus began to be a thing in the 80s. And by the late 80s, pretty much every manufacturer was scrambling to produce autofocus SLRs, autofocus points and shoots, autofocus, anything you like. And the original technology, as I understand it, used a sonar beam to measure the distance between the subject and the camera to reflect it back. Pretty soon other systems were used, infrared systems, and they became better and better and better. Certainly that on my Nikon L35AF point and shoot camera is a fantastic system and never seems to make a mistake. Similarly, that on my Canon EOS 3000, mind you, that is a late 90s autofocus camera or mid 90s autofocus camera, but the technology was perfected, and by the 1980s you could be pretty sure of getting that autofocus pretty much spot on as you wanted it. So that was a real exotic thing in the 70s that began to be more popular in the 80s. Now, of course, then, as now, if you're shooting on film, every shot counts. It's really important, or it was to me anyway, and still is, in fact, not to waste a frame of film, because film costs. Film is expensive. You can't just grab your digital and click, click, click away as we do now. You had to make sure that that shot was, as close to what you wanted as you can get, and you're not going to shoot until that shot is all lined up and right and just as you want it. Even if it's some sort of casual shot, you're going to wait for those right conditions to occur before you press that button. Film was available in 24 exposure and 36 exposure rolls, as it is now. You could also get 12 exposure rolls. That's in 35mm. In 110, you could get 12 exposure and 24 exposure, because the 110 cartridge isn't big enough, there's not room enough to fit 36 frames in it. So the most shots you could get on a roll of film was 36. Now, I never bought 36 exposure films until much later on, because 24 exposures were cheaper, and that suited me at the time. If you're shooting Polaroid, though, it gets even more difficult, because all you get is 8 shots in a pack. That was the 88 film that I used to shoot. It was restricted to 8 shots in a pack. So that was another limiting factor. You knew you couldn't just, click, 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 click to your heart's content. You knew you had to think about your shot. You knew you had to not waste that film, because it was expensive. Now, when it came to developing, just the same as now, you could either do it yourself or you could drop it off at a high street place to do it for you. Most of the time with colour film, people would just drop it in at Boots or, wherever they were, and let them get on with it. Very few people, as far as I'm aware, very, very few people develop their own colour film. It's more common now because people like to experiment, but at that time, 70s and 80s, almost nobody developed colour film apart from the professionals who were set up to do it. There was a lot of black and white development going on, as always. That's, that was and remains relatively simple to do. Now, if you wanted to drop off your black and white film for developing, so little was shot of it in those days that it would take a week to turn around. The maximum was a week to turn around. Unlike colour film, where you could drop it into your local Boots or Tesco or wherever you were, and they would do it in an hour for you. And here's the important bit. Developing places were everywhere. You couldn't move for them. Walk down any high street, you'll see 4, 5, 6 developing places, all trying to outcompete each other, all trying to offer the best service for the lowest cost. And they all knew what they were doing, which is not the case nowadays. Nowadays, there are certain places, I ain't going to name them because I ain't going to embarrass them, and for other reasons as well, but I dropped off a roll of colour film a week or so ago at a popular place and they made a mess of it. They scratched the film, it wasn't dried properly. You could see where the bubbles of water had dried before being, it hadn't been squeezed off. And it was a mess. And, I don't blame the people doing it because I don't think they've had the training. But at that time, anywhere did it. And they all did it really, really well. It was very, very rare to get, a badly developed roll. In fact, I never knew of that happening. So it's a curious thing. In those days, the 70s and 80s, the medium was very, very similar. Same rules, same discipline, same understanding. But it was also very, very different as well. And the thing that stands out for me from those days, the main thing that stands out for me, was that you just could not go and pick up your camera and just click, click, click wherever you wanted and take hundreds of shots if you wanted to for free. And that's the big difference. Photography, for me as a hobbyist, as a young teenage hobbyist at that time, photography for me was restricted. I couldn't go out and do it as much as I wanted to. I would have done it all day long if I could have done it. I'd have shot 10 rolls a day if I could have done. But, I didn't have the money to do that. That would have been an immense cost. Nowadays, you can do that easy, no problem. And that's really the main thing that stands out, was that you just couldn't do it as much as you wanted to. And what a great freedom these digital cameras have proved. Even though we still love film, I still love film and I still use film. My T70 here is loaded up with Kodak Ultra Max, so I still love film very much and I still use it, but it's changed. It's not the main way of doing things anymore. A new and, right, I'm going to say it, broadly speaking, better medium has arisen. Again, I'm speaking very broadly, but it doesn't have the inconvenience of film. It's far easier, it's far simpler. It's a bit more complex. The machines are a bit more complex, but, touch wood, they seem reliable enough. So a very similar situation at that time, but a very different one as well. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little stroll down the lane of memories, and I hope it's been of some interest. I've certainly enjoyed going back a little bit and reminiscing and sharing some memories. So I guess that's about it from me for this week. Many, many thanks to subscribers. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your support. And thank you also to patrons. A very, very heartfelt thanks to patrons without whom this channel couldn't do what it does in exactly the same way, and who have supported me through thick and through thin. So many, many thanks to you also. If you'd like to become a patron of this channel and support what we do here, then you can do that easily over at www.patreon.com/Zenography. So many, many thanks for watching. Many, many thanks for joining me today, and I will see you soon. I will see you next time for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.